And hello and welcome to this episode of Focus On. We are here at Inanda Club for Joburg Indaba. We're about to speak to Vusi Mpofu, who is the sector lead for mining and chemicals at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Banking. We're about to gather his insights as to what is happening in the mining sector with particular focus on capital allocation. Vusi, it's a pleasure to be chatting to you right now. You have just over 2 decades of experience in the financial services sector with a special focus on mining and chemicals. So I want to pick your brain. When you look at the recent changes in regulations, or let's say the evolution in regulation within the mining sector, what are the main challenges that the mining sector is currently facing and how are these being addressed?
Well, Tanya, thank you so much for having me today. I think when we look at mining, there's a broad number of factors that we actually look at. And the current regulatory changes that are obviously top of mind and that everyone is talking about is the world's progression towards a decarbonized planet, obviously in response to the Paris agreements where we are trying to reduce global temperatures by the 1.5 to 2 degrees that everyone keeps talking about. So obviously when you ask that question, we immediately start talking about energy. And when we talk about energy, the first issue really for South African mining is that we know that over the longest time, we've been dominated by quite a big chunk of coal miners. So the first impact is obviously going to be that there is a drying up of capital for the funding of fossil fuels. So for sure, the development of additional coal capacity is going to become far more difficult with third-party sources of funding, and there will be a greater reliance on operations to actually be able to fund themselves. And definitely funding that comes from outside of certain countries won't make it into the countries where those particular assets are developed. Obviously, the other one is that when you look at the emission reductions that everyone is being asked for, it thrusts to the fore the ESG agenda for all miners, which means that the operations must be decarbonized. The decarbonization is not only part of an ESG imperative, which speaks to responsible mining, but similarly, it's also to efficientize the operations, to make them more efficient. And we are at a great time in the history of mining because that opportunity to delve into and diversify into renewables answers multiple questions. The first one obviously is that you're able to replace a carbon-intensive energy mix with a far more cleaner energy mix, number one. And number two, it provides you with the stability which we currently don't probably enjoy with the utility in South Africa in the form of Eskom. I'll pause there briefly.
Yeah, and there's 2 topics that I want to dive in deeper that you've just mentioned. One being energy efficiency and the wider ESG and sustainability agenda, but also capital allocation. I mean, we're your Nedbank. So let's dive into that. How has this impacted capital allocation when it comes to the mining sector?
Well, I think most of the miners, which is a conversation that we've been having for the past few years, are coming out of a very good very good commodity support in terms of the cycle. So commodity prices have been high in the past few years. And what we're seeing now is a recession of those prices to more normalized levels. But what that meant is that initially the dividend from those high commodity prices was being deployed predominantly to what? Reward shareholders, number one. Number two, particularly in the South African context, we haven't seen a lot of expansionary capex or acquisitions per se, but what that meant is that the energy element was escalated up the capital allocation decision that is obviously critical to any business and more so in mining. So what has happened is that a lot of capital has been deployed to creating some security and stability around the electricity and the energy needs of these particular entities. But if you think that we've got at least 9 gigs that are going to be coming on stream in the next call it 3 to 5 years, 7.5 of that is coming from mining companies.
Sure,
So you
so
can see that it's really been elevated up in the capital allocation discussion.
absolutely. But then that raises the question of how exactly are mining companies distributing investments and funding that they receive?
When you talk about distributing the investment, so there's two things. The investment decision is critical for all businesses, and for miners, that investment has been going into, of course, energy, because it feeds into two things. Of course, it talks about the energy security, which we've been talking about, but it's also able to stabilize your costs going forward, which is a sustainable factor.
Yeah.
You know, so, and miners always talk about focusing on the controllables, and that's how you bring some control. So it's not, obviously the hazard is going to be in years to come. Miners must do what? Stick to their knitting.
Yeah.
So there will be a time in the future where there is consolidation of all these energy assets which will have been built up, and the miners will return to mining. But at the moment, it is a key role of the mining sector to support South Africa's energy, one, stability, two, energy transition. Because whether we like it or not, the world is migrating to a world that has got less reliance on fossil fuels. Of course, because South Africa has been thermal coal dependent for so long, this journey is going to be different. And that's really the only point of debate. To say, yes, we are on a glide path to net zero. The real debate is pace. How quickly do we get there? And that's really where most of the experts will differ.
And a lot of talk when we're talking energy stability and energy, well, just transition, a central focus point comes into energy efficiency and how we need to ensure that our mining companies are geared towards this energy efficiency. How are you looking at the factors that underpin this focus towards energy efficiency, and how are companies dealing with it?
The mining sector has got very well developed protocols, and that have been developed over hundreds of years. That's how all the mining industry is in South Africa. And I'll go back to my earlier point, control the controllables. Mining companies cannot control commodity prices, but they can control the cost of their operations. A large element of that cost control speaks to efficiencies.
Yeah.
And that is why when we talk about those efficiencies, yes, at the moment we talk about electricity and that whole energy mix, but it's more than that. You know, a mine has got a number of operations which require efficiencies to be introduced, whether it's in the air quality that we're able to have at very deep levels of mining, whether it's the way water is recycled and efficient water use. All of that rolls into that virtuous cycle of what miners have known to be that whole ESG imperative for a number of years.
Okay, brilliant. So then, when we're talking energy efficiency, a lot of talk is obviously around technology and the advancements in technology and how that's enabling us to be able to do this in a much more efficient and effective way. What are the key technological advancements that you've seen that are helping us in that way?
Well, fortunately, the yoke or the responsibility of being at the forefront of the technological advancement is not only owned by mining companies. So when we talk about those advancements in technology that take us to a greener future, it is a shared responsibility. But we do accept that as miners, we are apex users of energy. Therefore, when we talk about what a lot of people call critical minerals, but what we at Nedbank like to call transition minerals, because as we evolve, you know, you're seeing greater demand coming through for your coppers, lithiums, cobalt, and so on. But as technologies evolve, we will find that there is greater demand for other minerals. And that's where the maths becomes a bit iffy because a lot of commitments have been made. Those commitments require critical minerals, transition minerals, call it what you will, but the capacity to actually supply those particular minerals is not yet embedded into the pipeline. So that whole supply chain that we talk about to underpin the energy transition that everyone is talking about. That's where the miners come in, where we've got to be able to, as best possible, identify one, the sources of these critical minerals. Number two, those geographies and appetite to actually have operations in those particular jurisdictions, and when necessary, the development of those particular assets to the extent that they are able to supply the just transition that everybody talks about.
And the other part to that is, of course, the aspect of renewable energy. Where does that fit into it? How has this changed the way that capital is being allocated, that investments are made? What are your views on this?
Of course, renewable energy is in vogue at the moment. It's a critical element of the shifting energy mix. You know, whether we like it or not, the energy mix is changing. There's going to be less capital deployed to fossil fuel generation capacity. You'll have seen that from the South African ERA, once the cap was moved, that became the game changer for South African mines. And the development that we've seen in that independent power production capacity has really been off the scale. It's been the new frontier from a capital allocation perspective. So renewables are incredibly important in the energy mix, but they are not the one thing that must be considered in a stable energy future. What we need to be doing rather is not only talking about the renewables, but saying, okay, how do we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels? What does a future energy mix look like? And what other elements are we able to bring in?
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing your insights and knowledge. And that's it for this episode of Focus On. Stay tuned for more.